Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Francine Klagsbrun is the author of more than a dozen books, including one of my true favorites, Lioness, Golda Meir and the Nation of Israel. It received the 2017 National Jewish Book Award, Everett Family Foundation Book of the Year. Fran was a regular columnist for the Jewish Week, a contributing editor to Lilith, and on the editorial board of Hadassah magazine. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Newsweek, and Ms. magazine. She has served as chairwoman of the Board of Overseers of the Jewish Theological Seminary Library and secretary of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Museum. In 1988, at the first International Jewish Feminist Conference in Jerusalem, a group of women organized a prayer service at the Western Wall and selected Francine to carry the Torah at the head of the group, making her the first woman to carry a Torah to the Kotel. Her latest book, Henrietta Szold, Hadassah and the Zionist Dream, which we are going to talk about today, was published March 5th, 2024 by Yale University Press. Full disclosure, she is a family friend for as long as I can remember. It's wonderful to see you, Fran.
It's great to see you, and thank you for having me.
No, I wish we were in the same place, but let's talk about this wonderful book. There have been other biographies, in fairness, and you give credit to those that precedes your own. What did you think hadn't been said about Henrietta Szold that made you want to take your own dive?
Two things. I would say one was her insecurities. This is a woman who accomplished so much and yet was always questioning herself and always not even recognizing her own wonderful abilities at organization. She'd call it just doing her duty and sort of put herself down. And people portrayed her mostly as an angel, as a saint, as this wonderful woman. And people never looked at her faults or her insecurities. And I thought that was very worthwhile.
Yes, and it makes her just a much fuller human being. And before we get to all of those kind of shades of her personality, let's talk about sort of the high level, what she's famous for. For someone who's never heard of Henrietta Szold, what is she most famous for?
She was most famous for founding Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, which grew to be one of the greatest, probably the largest Zionist organization in the world. So that is what she's most famous for. And of course, Hadassah members know her. But in addition, in her early life, she started an evening school for immigrants to teach them English. It was the first of such schools, and it became copied and modeled for other schools all over the country.
Wasn't that for Russian immigrants in particular?
Immigrants, absolutely, who were swarming into the United States at that time. And then it was copied for all immigrants. And Mayor LaGuardia, who was the mayor of New York City, you're so young you won't know him, but
Fiorello LaGuardia. There's a musical, so I know about LaGuardia from the musical.
I actually lived during his time. He spoke about how her school for Russian immigrants had influenced people like him, Italian immigrants, and so on, to learn English. So that was in her early life. In her later life, this is now in addition to Hadassah, and doing all sorts of things in mandated Palestine. But the great thing she did in her later life was head an organization called Youth Aliah.
I want to say that slowly. It's Youth Aliah.
Aliah, that saved thousands of first German and then children from all over the world during the Holocaust. And that was, she considered her greatest accomplishment. And it's hard to know because she had so many accomplishments, but it was certainly a great.
Let's just drill down for a minute on Youth Aliah, because I think a lot of people don't actually understand that history. What was actually the project of saving children, and weren't many coming orphaned or without even knowing if their parents were dead or alive?
Absolutely. It's a sad story for children, and yet it's a happy story for them because it saved so many lives. It actually wasn't her idea. It was the idea of another woman named Rebecca, who wanted to do this, but Henrietta didn't think at the beginning that children would want to leave their homes and come to live in mandated Palestine. As the Holocaust and World War II progressed, German parents in particular knew that their lives and the lives of their children were in great jeopardy. And Henrietta, at that point, took over, became head of the bureau in Jerusalem to save these children. And that bureau was called Youth Aliah, the going up of children. Aliah means to go up. The going up, going to Palestine, mandate Palestine and later Israel, of course, was always considered going up. And so they began by training people, training counselors, and training children in Germany, and then later it expanded to other countries, to learn how to live in this now really quite rugged land of mandate Palestine, pre-Israel, to live on settlements, to do agricultural work. Children who, were living in cities, who were in fine schools in Germany, were now changing their lives because their parents knew that their lives and the children's lives were in terrible jeopardy, as we all know what happened in World War II. And so children began coming under the auspices of this organization into Mandate Palestine. And Henrietta headed that organization. She would meet boatloads of children as they came into the Haifa port and help them get settled. And what was sort of so touching to me, these children spoke German. The children who were already in Palestine spoke Hebrew. They kind of looked down. Germany now was the enemy. But Henrietta understood, and she spoke German to these children. She helped them get settled. If they brought with them books by Schiller or Heine or whoever was the great German writers, she said it's okay. There was a great culture. Try to remember that great German culture. Try to, if you can, forget the terrible things that happened to you.
And as don't some of those kids, as they grew up, didn't they have real clear memories of her?
They did have memories of her. They called her mother. She became what was known, this is a woman who never married or had children, became known as a mother in Israel. Mm-hmm. And they called her mother. And that was because so many of them lost their own parents during the Holocaust. And it was so sad. They would get off their boats and say, when is Mama coming? And the people like Henrietta and the others knew that Mama was never going to make it. And these children had to be adjusted, and she helped them adjust.
And you talk about the poignancy of the fact that she herself was never a mother. And there's just sort of a cruel irony there, because it isn't necessarily something she chose. What do you make of the fact that that was just a sorrow, a lifelong sorrow for her?
Well, we have to go back to her great love of a man who jilted her, basically. And this goes way back when she wasn't that young. She was already in her 40s, but she became a student in order to publish. Her father, who was a rabbi, publish his written works. She became a student at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. I will say, as just a side story, she had to promise not to want to become a rabbi, because this was a rabbinical school for men, and she did promise that.
I just want to make sure that people heard that. So at JTS, they said you can enroll as long as you commit to the fact that you're never going to try to be clergy because you're a woman, correct?
Exactly. And it took 70 years later till the JTS began. And I was very active in the struggle to have women ordained as rabbis at JTS. So I saw this as a very personal thing. She promised not to be a rabbi. Nor was she interested in that. She really wanted to study. Anyway, she fell in love with one of her professors, Louis Ginsburg, he was not only her professor, she was herself a very knowledgeable and educated woman. Even though she didn't go to college, she was very educated, knowledgeable. She read a great deal, and she spoke German. And she could help Louis Ginsburg and the other professors who themselves had come from Germany. She helped them. But with Louis Ginsburg in particular, she helped translate what he wrote. She helped him with his great, great work, which was called Legends of the Jews, which began as one volume and morphed into 7 volumes. She helped him, she translated, she organized, she edited, and they became very close.
And can you just say, Fran, sorry, what is the age difference between Professor Louis Ginsburg? Is it Louis or Louis? Do you know?
Louis Ginsburg.
Louis Ginsburg. And he was a giant, right? Was he a giant at the time, or was it early in his career?
He was always he was a giant from the beginning. He was young, but let's go back. She was 13 years older than he. And she said, but he was already a giant. He was hired as a famous Talmudic scholar. And he knew of himself as a scholar. He was not exactly modest. But she was so taken with him, and he spent a great deal of time with her. He ate lunch and dinner in her home. On Saturday, Shabbat morning, they would go to the synagogue and the seminary. He would nod at her, and she would be up in separate, either in a balcony. I think they had a balcony at that time. I'm not sure, but he would nod at her, and they would sort of agree that way to go out together and to take walks together. But she kept saying to herself, you mustn't, knew she was falling in love with this man. But she said, you mustn't do this. You're much too old for him. She's really tried to keep herself in control. She kept a journal of her feelings, and she wrote her feelings. She was down in the journal. She was crazy in love with him. But she kept this under control until his father died. And then he poured out his heart to her. He wrote letter after letter to her about how he felt, and she comforted him. And then she thought to herself, it's changed. He's in love with me now. And she saw what she called a love light in his eyes, and she thought this was going to be it.
And she thought that he was going to propose to her.
Yes, he thought this was it. He was going to propose to her. And he went on a trip. He often went to Europe during the summer. And he went on this trip, and he came back, and he said he wanted to speak to her alone. And that was the moment when she thought this was maybe a proposal. And he said to her, it makes my heart turn and twisted. He said to her, you will be happy to know that I am engaged. And that was to another woman, not to her. And she almost fainted. She had to keep herself from fainting. The woman was a lovely woman, much younger than he. But after all.
Do you mean the one that he was engaged to? Was it Adele or Adela?
Adele. He was engaged to a beautiful woman, a terrific woman. And as I wrote in my book, I knew her because in much later life, later than Henrietta's life, I studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I was a student in college during the daytime and the seminary in the evenings and on Sundays. And so I knew her. And after he married her, she was a lovely woman. I mean, it wasn't her fault. But most of us felt that he betrayed Henrietta. Now, Henrietta's family felt, well, they had a lot of correspondence. There was never an intimate word said in that correspondence. He never said, I love you. He never said, you're beautiful. Well, she wasn't beautiful, but there was never anything personal. So she imagined this. On the other hand, everybody at the seminary was sure that they were a couple and they would get married. So this was a terrible thing. And then she had a nervous breakdown, essentially, that lasted.
And I just want to pause on that nervous breakdown, because just reading it, it's so shattering. I mean, it's just one of those, if it were a love story in a movie, you'd just be sobbing through it. Here's this person who has truly selflessly, I mean, she was obviously growing from it intellectually and was an intellectual powerhouse herself, but she basically subjugated her life for his. And it's, just the wake-up call of the disillusionment of that he doesn't love her and isn't choosing her. She's really undone by it. I mean, it's such an inflection point, clearly, in your book, in her life. And it's amazing that she recovers and goes on to what she goes on from. And I don't, always hesitant as a feminist to reduce someone to their unrequited love, because she's so much more than that. But it does feel decisive.
Now, the interesting thing is, as I wrote, I speculated, and again, nobody has speculated. So what would have happened if she had married him? She would have then subjected her life to his life. Her life would have evolved around his life and the seminary. She wouldn't have accomplished all the things that I don't believe, who knows, but that she had accomplished. She really went through this horrible depression, a real depression, and she kept this journal where she wrote all of her emotions in it. Day after day, she looked back on everything that happened and wrote down every feeling. But somehow she was strong enough to pull herself through this and to change her life, to change the direction of her life. There were, of course, feelings beforehand, ideas, women, things she was interested in about women and so on. But she really turned it around and said, okay, this is now, somehow said, okay, this is now behind me. She never mentioned his name again, never spoke about him again, and started this new life and started Hadassah, this great organization.
So
now he and his family, jokingly, I thought a very cruel joke, would say he was really the father of Hadassah because if he hadn't rejected her, she wouldn't start Hadassah. But
we're putting it in terms of a man again.
Right.
But let me ask you about Zionism governed her life. Is that you have that in your book, and that she thought that Zionism was crucial to Judaism. Where did she get that? Like where? Because she grows up in Baltimore, so where is the sort of Zionist fervor coming from?
From two places. One, the idea that Zionism, that the land of Israel, was a homeland of the Jewish people, and was part of the whole of Judaism. That basic idea came from her father. He believed that. Her father was a rabbi, a prominent rabbi, Benjamin Zold. But her beliefs and her real understanding of Zionism came from a group of Russian immigrants, those kind of immigrants for whom she started her night school. These were a literary group that met and were very committed to Zionism, to early Zionism, and spoke about it and had meetings and had a literary club. And she was very taken with them and really developed this idea, picked up the idea of the centrality of Zionism to Judaism. The feeling was, her attitude always was, that Judaism is not complete. It's not just about laws. It's not just about religion. But that Judaism and Jews are a people, just as Herzl would say later, that Jews are a people, and that living in their own homeland, not that everybody had to live there in her day, did she think that, nor did she think of her homeland in political terms, but that this was the homeland of the Jewish people. And if they didn't accept that and see it as part of their thinking, then they weren't seeing the whole of Judaism. That was her attitude.
So where does the idea for Hadassah come from?
Well, at that time, she lived at a time when we called them club women. A lot of women were meeting in clubs in those days, not only Jewish women, women in general. This was sort of a thing going on. And there were many little clubs of women meeting to talk about the land of Israel, about Zionism, small Zionist clubs. And she belonged to one of those clubs. And that was okay. She was a part of it. But when, after this whole terrible event with Louis Ginsburg happened, she and her mother went to a trip abroad. Her mother really wanted to get her away. And they went part of that time to the land of Israel, to the Holy Land, to abandoned Palestine. And in a way, it was her mother who said, after seeing the poverty and the need for health care in that land, her mother said, you and your group, instead of talking abstractly about Zionism and meeting all these wonderful writers, you should do something. You should actually help these people in a very physical and a very real way. And that was, I think, her mother planted that seed in her head. And then back in her groups, she kind of brought that idea to the groups.
And when you were retracing her life, I know you are just an unbelievable, meticulous researcher. Did you work on the Golda book for 10 years, was it? More? Amazing. And you speak Hebrew, and you can translate things. But what were your materials for this? Like how, again, were you retracing her steps in your research?
Well, what I did was I read, all whatever books there were about her, but I also, much of what I concentrated on, because I wanted to get to the person herself, not just, this outside story. So I concentrated on her letters, and that was her letters to her family, her letters to her friends, some of which had never been published before and had not been looked at, some of which had been. But I really focused on that to trace her story itself through her own eyes and through her own vision of what she wanted and what she saw.
And was there anything in particular that surprised you? I mean, you'd had your own preconceptions about her.
I guess I was surprised at, first of all, how broad her knowledge was. I mean, I knew she was this great lady, people said it, blah, blah, but she was so knowledgeable in so many areas. And this is a woman who didn't go to college. She was always regretted that she didn't go to college. Her parents didn't have the money. She didn't want to leave the family. There were a lot of younger sisters, but she had read so much and knew so much. So I don't know, surprised, but I was awed by that. I will say that. And then I guess I was maybe in a way surprised at how quickly she was able to organize. When she made this Hadassah idea started, and she devoted herself to it. She was an incredible organizer. I mean, it was one of the things I wrote, and I said that earlier. She didn't see that as a creative skill. She sort of saw herself as doing her duty. But she was a brilliant organizer. I mean, she could do things to get this big organization going with no money and get it going. And suddenly there were all these chapters. She got her friends to start chapters in various cities. She herself went to the cities. She knew exactly what to do. She would not have two chapters of Hadassah in the same city because they might compete with each other. I mean, I don't know I wouldn't know how to do it. I wouldn't know how to start an organization. Right?
It's really true. And what about the fact that you say that she was not political? She didn't see herself as political. She didn't like politics. But here she is kind of defying the norms and strictures about what women are supposed to do, let alone create and build. So would you call her sort of a proto-feminist? I mean, obviously those words are sometimes facile, but it seems like she was really charting new territory.
I absolutely would call her a proto-feminist or pre-feminist. Absolutely. And she cared about, I mean, that was also interesting. Things evolved. At one point, there was a study group and people wrote, her friends asked her about changing, in Palestine at that time. And now the rabbinites controlled so much about women's lives, and they still do. And some of her friends wrote and said, why is this so? Why should women be in charge of their own divorces, for example, which is still an issue today? And at first she said, well, we don't want to make too many breaks and quarrels within the tradition. We want things to be together. But as time evolved, she became sort of radical in that sense. Yes, things should change. She saw that as very important. She saw it as important that women develop skills that they never had before. The Hadassah women developed. I was so impressed as I was studying this and reading this. We've talked about, the Hadassah ladies, they do this and that. These women were women who were housewives, who were middle-class women. And here they learned how to give speeches. They learned how to run meetings. They learned how to talk to heads of states. And she trained them. And that was an incredible skill that she had and developed and believed in, because she came to believe in the importance of women.
So when she died, there was tributes to her in Israel. She died in Israel. They called her a mother of Israel, the likes of whom have not risen through the ages, which was just a beautiful tribute. She seemed to ultimately, even though she saw herself as an American till the end, Israel was really the place she wanted to be and end her life. Is that true?
That is true. I'm afraid we can't call it Israel because it wasn't Israel at that time. It's very complicated now to call it Palestine because Palestine has a different meaning. So I try to say British mandated Palestine, but we know what we're talking about. This was pre-Israel. But she had done so much work there. And so devoted herself. She started their social service system. They didn't have a real social service system. She did so much for their education. Teachers were not getting paid. Schools were being closed. Things were being run inefficiently. Again, with its brilliant efficiency and organization skills she had, she put that all on the map. She did all of those kinds of things. And so she really became a crucial part of what would become the land of Israel. What she did, her legacy continued and continues today, actually. And it's a really beautiful thing.
It's extraordinary. And just to end on her legacy, you write that she sat for a bust. An artist, I guess a sculptor, was making a bust of her towards, I guess, the last quarter of her life, and that she asked him to, she said, make my eyes look to the future. And I guess I would ask you, especially because we're talking post-October 7th, in this moment, you can't imagine what she would have said about this chapter, but where do you see the Hadassah legacy and her, everything that she kind of created? Where do you see that making a difference now?
Well, I think it still makes a huge difference. And I think Hadassah is still a tremendously important organization. Hadassah started the first medical care for people in the land of Israel. And that continues. Hadassah Hospital is a crucial hospital. And everything that Hadassah does is related to caring for the people of the land. What would Henrietta, I keep thinking to myself, what would she say about after October 7th? She would be so horrified, because she also, we didn't touch on this, but we should. She really cared very much about the Arabs in the land, and she felt it was very important that the Jews made peace with them. And every organization, every institution, she insisted that Muslims, Christians, and Jews are treated alike. The staff of Hadassah Hospital includes Arab, now we call them Palestinians. In those days they didn't, but Palestinian doctors and nurses. She cared very much about that. She would have been horrified about this Hamas betrayal in October 7th. But let's not end on that sad note. I think her legacy is much broader than that. It's a legacy of caring about the people. It's a legacy of Hadassah, a legacy about caring about children. Youth Aliah continues, and now it's not children from other lands, but it's children, underprivileged children in Israel who were cared for by Youth Aliah. The education system and the social service systems she began, many elements continue today. So she left a very important legacy to the land.
Francine Klagsbrun, thank you for this very wonderful biography. It is called Henrietta Szold, Hadassah and the Zionist Dream. Please get it for someone you care about. It's a story that inspires me. I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight, and I'll see you next time.